Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cosmos with an interview on New Testament and Biblical Greek. Oh, wow. Today we have Professor Richard Bell, who specializes, as I've said, in New Testament and Biblical Greek. So anything regarding the matters of the Gospels or Acts of Apostles and other epistles, as well as learning the language, the Koine Greek, in which Jesus had spoken. Yes, he was the person in our department you talked to for that sort of thing. So, yeah, well, I'll start with the first question. Richard, what do you love or find useful about studying New Testament and Biblical Greek, personally?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me on this program or whatever, or broadcast, Jack. It's lovely to be here, and just hello to everybody. What do I love about it? Well, I'll tell you one of the things that often strikes me in the past. People have come up to me often after church and they said, "Oh, what are these academics doing? These, professors in lecturers in universities. I don't want to be bothered with scholarship. I just want to read the Bible." Yeah. And my response to that is, well, if you're reading the Bible in English, you are dependent upon scholarship. In fact, scholarship that's gone on for centuries. And the thing about studying the New Testament in Greek is that you're looking at the New Testament in the original language. Now, to be honest, even working with the Greek New Testament, you're still dependent upon scholarship, because at some point people have actually looked at these ancient manuscripts, have tried to had to decipher them and so on, and they've had to put together what's called a critical edition. I'll say more about that later on. But so yeah, so even in my position, I'm dependent upon other scholars. But as I say, if you work with the English, you are terribly dependent on other scholars. And the nice thing about learning the Greek, I mean, it's a lot of work, but once you have it, it gives you, dare I say, a greater authority in dealing with the New Testament, because you can try to understand what the various words mean in Greek, how the different words are put together in sentences, how the words can be interpreted, and so on. And so that really is my key message. Learning New Testament Greek means that it's rather being in a brightly lit room. Whereas when you have the English, perhaps it's a little bit like being a room with lots of candles, but you haven't got that, should we say, the transparency.
Yeah, I see. So, yeah, that does actually tie in your mention about all the people who perhaps might want to just want to read the Bible and not rely on academia. There will be quite a few, I'm assuming, non-academics in the audience as well. But in fact, they may be curious to know a little bit about what we do with the Greek, the art of exegetical writing essays, the kind of resources we use in dictionaries and concordances. Would you like to explain a little bit about that to the audience?
Yeah, I could explain what we do. I mean, I'll show you what the basic toolkit is. I just basically have here. So this is, oh, Jack will recognize this. This is the New Testament in Greek.
Oh yeah, got me own copy, obviously.
We're using that, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
this.
that's right. Yeah.
This bad boy.
So that's the basic thing. And then you need a dictionary, or what we say, a lexicon. And again, Jack will recognize this. Yes.
Abbott Smith, I'm assuming.
Yes, Abbott Smith.
Yes,
Yeah,
I've got this for Christmas as well for perfect
yeah.
use.
And so this will give you a Greek word. It will give you the possible translations. And also, what it will do, it will tell you what the Hebrew equivalent is. Now, I'll just say something about this. All right. So you probably know that originally the what we call the Old Testament or the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings was originally written in Hebrew with some Aramaic. But what happened is that shortly before the time of Jesus, this was translated into various Greek translations, and that's called the Septuagint. And so this is what I have here. So because the Hebrew was translated into Greek, often you can look at these correspondences. So you can look at a Greek word, and then you can find the corresponding Hebrew word. Now, because virtually all the authors of the New Testament were Jewish, all right, it's rather important to consider what is the Hebrew equivalent for all these various Hebrew terms. And what you can do, I've got something here which is called a concordance to the Septuagint. Yeah, this is by Hatch and Redpath. So you can look up a Greek word, you can see what the Hebrew equivalent is, and this may be able to shine a light. So let me just give you an example. I think it'd be a really good example. If you take Romans 3:25, I'm sure many of you will recognize this. So Paul is talking about righteousness through faith in this passage. And he says that people are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Now, in the New Revised Standard Version, it runs, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement. All right. Now, that term sacrifice of atonement, you can look at the Greek, and the Greek term for that is hilasterion. Hilasterion, right? Yeah. And in the Septuagint, this is the term used for the mercy seat. So you got these texts in, for example, Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and so on, which talk about the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant has a top piece. It's not a lid. A lid implies you can take it off, but it's a top piece. It's of solid gold. And this mercy seat represents the presence of God and the place of the atonement, right? Now, so in the Greek, Romans 3:25, you've got this Greek term, hilasterion. You can then look at all the passages in Hatch and Redpath. You can find them. You see that the Hebrew equivalent is usually kaporet. Kaporet, so you got kapara. Think of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. All right, so it's kaporet. And you could therefore have this translation that God publicly set forth Christ as a mercy seat, as a hilasterion. So for Paul, the mercy seat, i.e., the presence of God and the place of the atonement, is now on Golgotha. So that's an example how you can apply Greek in this process of translation. And in fact, a number of translators have actually translated it thus, yeah, whom God publicly set forth as a mercy seat. So when you think of the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat, that was hidden in the Holy of Holies behind the veil. The only person who could access that area was Aaron, or high priest, and he could only access that once a year on the Day of Atonement. So in Leviticus and so on, the hilasterion is hidden away. And what Paul is saying is that now Christ as a mercy seat has been publicly set forth. So I think that's rather a nice illustration as to how working with the Greek can possibly open up the meaning of the text. Now, I should say, not everybody's going to agree with what I say here, but this is just one example of how you can work with the Greek text.
Nice. Yes. And from all of the lectures I remember in New Testament studies, many debates around certain passages and concepts come up. Could you please run us through a few of them, perhaps? Maybe explain the proponents and opponents of this. So it could virginal conception could make the list, but then the matter of Christology could be another. How would you answer this question?
I'll give you another example, Jack. A very nice example is, if I may just do Romans again, Romans chapter 10. In Romans chapter 10, let me read from verse 12. Paul says there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, it's Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and is generous to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now, that is a quotation from the book of Joel. Now, if you look at the Hebrew has the divine name. That's often we translate that as Yahweh. So you've got Yahweh, Yahweh. So in the Hebrew, you've got Yahweh. Everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh shall be saved. But then in the Septuagint, that's rendered using the term kurios, which we can translate as Lord. So what Paul has in the Septuagint is whoever calls on the kurios, the name of the Lord, kurios, shall be saved. So what he's doing here, he's saying this text actually refers not to the Jehovah of the Old Testament, but it actually refers to Jesus Christ. So this is rather a nice example where studying the Greek, comparing that to Hebrew, means you can end up with a highly exalted view of Christ. Um, I mean, this is perhaps a rather controversial point, but if you look at the translation of the Jehovah's Witnesses, they have everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah shall be saved. Yeah? So they have Jehovah because they say, well, I guess quite rightly, that in the Hebrew, you've got the divine name, Yehovah. But Paul, though, is using the Septuagint, which is kurios. So he's talking about calling on the name of Jesus. So that's one example of Christology, which I think is rather nice.
Yeah, that is definitely very interesting. So to finish off, could you share three fun facts from the world of biblical Greek? Of course, in every lecture, you never cease to deliver on this. In fact, you probably already have. But what can you say in terms of fun facts?
Well, I might just end up just giving one example, if I may, because there's quite a lot of stuff to say here. But let me take again another example from Romans. All right, there's a very important text in chapter 1 of Romans. And I'll just read it. This is Romans 1:16 and 17. He says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous through faith will live." That's a translation of the New Revised Standard Version. I've changed it slightly, actually, but we won't worry about that now. Now, the big question is, what does he mean when he says that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed? And there's a fascinating story here. Because if you go back to Martin Luther, as an Augustinian monk, he was originally reading this in the Latin. And what he would read, that in the gospel, the justice of God is revealed. All right. So this haunted the sensitive monk Luther, and it actually led to almost to a spiritual crisis because he thought that in the gospel, God's justice in punishing sinners is revealed. Then what he did, of course, he said, well, the sensible thing is actually to go to the Greek. And in the Renaissance, which came just before the Reformation, there was this great interest in, going back to the original texts. So if this was originally in Greek, you should go to the Greek and not simply work with the Latin. Now, Martin Luther then saw that that the word there for righteousness was in Greek, it's dikaiosune, dikaiosune. Now, this is a very, very long story, and I'm not going to go through all the history of it. But just bringing this up to date, I would say this. If you want to understand what Paul means by righteousness of God, and the word righteousness there is dikaiosune, the most important thing is to go back to the Septuagint and see how that is used. And there's one text which is so interesting, where it's Isaiah 51, verse 6. And this is where it says, but my salvation, God's salvation, will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. Okay? And so you've got salvation, and in fact, the word for deliverance there is righteousness. Then when you look at that, it looks as though righteousness could mean salvation. And it's, in fact, what you often find in Isaiah, get it in the Psalms, you get these texts where you get a parallelism between the word salvation and righteousness. So let's now apply that to Romans 1:17. In the gospel, the righteousness, the salvation of God is revealed. And it fits almost perfectly. In fact, I would say, yeah, it does fit perfectly. All right. So now you might say, well, why didn't Paul write then the word salvation? We've got a Greek word for salvation. Why did he write about the righteousness of God? And the reason he uses the term righteousness is that he wants to emphasize one particular aspect of salvation, and that is what's called the forensic aspect. Now, forensic simply means as it's used in the Jewish law courts. And in the Jewish law courts, you'd have civil cases. A and B would come to the judge, and the judge would then decide between them. And for one of them, he would justify, and the Greek for that is dikaio, and the other one he would condemn. All right. So think of the word righteousness, dikaiosune, is very much related to the term I acquit, or I put somebody in the right. So the reason Paul talks about the righteousness of God rather than the salvation of God is that he wants to emphasize this forensic aspect of salvation. And I think this is one of the most important things in studying the New Testament, to understand what it means by righteousness. Because often people think that righteousness is always to do with, something to do with how we behave. But in this text, it's actually talking about the salvation of God. So, Jack, I hope that is a nice example for you.
Yeah. Well, sure it is. Sure it is. Thank you for everyone who's still listening at this point. Yeah, thanks to Richard for these amazing questions. And yes, you're still where do they do biblical Greek in Nottingham? Are they doing it in the languages centre? Because I'm trying to remember whether we still do it in the department after I've left.
No, 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 now it's been taught in classics, in the classics department,
Oh,
actually.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And
with that being said, thank you everyone for watching. Have a great day, and yeah, I see you later. Bye.